everyone, welcome to Modern Application Development Part 2. So now we are going to look a little bit more in detail at what webhooks are and look at an example of how a webhook might be implemented and how you can sort of pass information from one server to another as part of the webhook. So what is a webhook? It's a way for an app to provide other applications or apps with real-time information. Okay, so this definition is something that I have picked up from an article on the SendGrid website. SendGrid is again a service that allows you to send email messages, right, bulk email messages or in general email messages. And they also provide their own webhooks, right. They have an article about webhooks, which is, there are a number of useful articles written by people who usually provide these services that are worth reading to understand better what was their motivation for providing webhooks. In this case, it's very clear. One app wants to tell another app, right? When I say app, I'm just talking about a process or an application, right? That might be running on different servers that are completely unrelated to each other. And this notion of real-time information is something that is useful to keep in mind, right? Because ultimately what we are interested in is how do I get real-time information, meaning that as soon as an event has happened, I want server A to be able to send a message to server B. Okay. Now the mechanism that is provided is a regular HTTP request, because of which this is sometimes also called a web callback, right, or an HTTP push API, right. Why API? Because at the end of the day it is a programming interface, right, it's an application programming interface. It allows you to communicate between one application and another. Okay. HTTP push because it is using the HTTP protocol and it is pushing messages from one server to another. Now you have to be a little careful with this terminology because there is actually something else called the HTTP push protocol, which of course is related to this, but HTTP push protocol has a very specific definition. It's an IETF standard, right, and therefore this term HTTP push API that I'm using over here is a little bit more loosely defined, right. But the reason why it's used is because it helps to convey a clear picture of what is being attempted out here. Similarly, you have the term the web callback, right, that's a bit easier to understand. It's based on web technologies and you can literally think of it as a callback, right. I register a callback, meaning that app A tells app B, whenever you want to inform me about something, just call me back on this URL. Okay. As I mentioned, it uses the regular HTTP protocol, right, the standard HTTP protocol, usually either a post request or occasionally a get request. Post is more common for the simple reason that within this callback, you might also want to pass a small amount of information, right. You usually don't want to have huge amounts of information, only a very small amount, because otherwise it becomes a full-blown HTTP request and sort of defeats the purpose of this lightweight messaging idea that we have been talking about. Get requests are problematic because everything has to be encoded into the URL. You cannot really get a whole lot of useful information across over there. So post is more common, it's structured, it's easier to send across, right, and it's a simple enough URL to use. It also means that post requests are generally not cached, right, and which is a good thing. For these web callbacks, you don't really want the results to be cached because that sort of defeats the purpose of a callback. This webhook is sometimes also called a reverse API for reasons that I already mentioned, right. An API is usually used in order to pull data from a server. For example, the list of courses you are enrolled in, the list of students enrolled in a given course, right, all of that information is pulled out as part of APIs. Of course, you do also have the rest of the CRUD, which is to create, update or delete, where you are sort of pushing information onto the server, right, but for the most part REST APIs and similar kind of mechanisms are used to pull information off the server. Whereas a webhook is very clear, it's not even trying to do a CRUD operation, right, it's just passing a message from one server to another, right, it's pushing a message from one server to another, and hence the terminology reverse API, right. Once again, like I said, this is not some kind of a standard terminology, these are just terms that are in common use because they help to understand how these systems are working. One very important sort of distinguishing factor between a webhook and a messaging queue is that a webhook is actually synchronous. What does that mean? You are making a call, right? You are making the call back, and when you make the call back, you have to connect and you have to be able to send the message, right? In general, webhooks do not provide for retry or store and forward or store and retry, right? Those kind of mechanisms that message queues provide you with. If the server to which you are trying to make the call back is offline, it just gives up. It doesn't really try. Okay. So the whole idea is that the webhook should also therefore be something that just calls and returns immediately. It shouldn't make the caller sort of wait for a long time, right? The expectation is that when I post something to a webhook, whoever is receiving that information just accepts the data and sort of gives me back a response code immediately, and then does whatever they want behind the scenes, right? They might get ready to do some new work or something of that sort. But if you sort of hold it up and say that you're going to keep that connection occupied, that's effectively in some sense abusing the system, right? You are doing something which is not expected by the person invoking the webhook. So for example, if you register a webhook with someone like GitHub and your webhook is such that it just sort of hangs for a long time, GitHub is probably not going to like it, and over time they might find that this is blocking their resources and they might just stop using that webhook, or they might kill off that functionality for you. Okay. So the idea is that you make a brief synchronous call, but the important point is webhooks are fundamentally synchronous. They do not sort of allow you to just leave a message and then get back later. Okay, that if you need that kind of functionality, what do? You use a messaging queue. So I'm going to show you a bit of an example of what you can do with something like GitLab. Okay, so GitHub and GitLab are both very well known and popular Git hosting systems. Okay, so Git by itself is a version control system. GitHub and GitLab are front ends, are web based front ends that provide a lot of additional functionality on top of just storing the Git repository. Okay, and this whole idea of a webhook is not part of Git, it's part of GitHub and GitLab. They provide that functionality for you. There's nothing fundamental about a webhook in connection with Git. Okay, so what I'm going to show here is how you can set up the receiver first, right? You need to have something that will receive your webhook, okay? And once you are able to receive that webhook, you can decide what to do with it, okay? Now, one of the things that we have over here is actually there's this website called request bin, right? And request bin essentially allows you to create temporary receivers, right? All that those receivers do is they will accept any request that is sent to them and log them along with all the data that came along with it, which means that we can use it, for example, to debug a webhook. So let's see how that works. So if you go to requestbin.com, it in turn takes you to a website called pipedream.com, which is essentially sort of the parent company of whoever created request bin, right? So you could create a public request bin if necessary, or you could just log in with your Google account, for example, and create something that will persist, right? So now what I have done in this case is I have created an account, and after that I created a new request bin. Okay? And when I click on create new request bin, what ends up happening is I see this page out here, which basically gives me some information on the right hand side saying this is the trigger, and it gives me more data, right? It says your workflow runs on requests to this endpoint, right? So look at the endpoint, it is something HTTPS, some strange string of characters, something.pipedream.net, okay? And what we expect is that if I make a request to this particular URL, I should find some information popping up out here on the left hand side, okay? So let me first just copy this URL, right? Open a new tab, just paste it in there, and let's see whether anything comes up as a result. So you can see that some kind of JSON data, right, has been displayed out here, okay? So what exactly happened? When I connected to request bin, I can also see now that on the left hand side, it says where it was saying waiting for events, it now says today there was an HTTP get slash at this particular time. Okay. So in other words, what has happened is this particular URL, this endpoint that has been provided to me by request bin, when I directly make a request to it, right, it's a GET request, it just returns some JSON data which is some about information, right. It basically tells me something about Pipedream, okay, and it also tells you about how it's the fastest way to connect APIs. It's a description of their service, okay. How is this useful for us? What it means is that any request that is made to this particular URL, on the left hand side when I click on it, it will show me a lot of details about it. Okay, it basically tells me the trigger, it says where the client was, what the headers were that was sent by the client, right. It also says exactly what the query was, right, and it also tells me a little bit more detail about the exact code, the response body, right, which was essentially the JSON data that was sent back to me. Okay, so what it has done is it has taken the entire data that was sent as part of the request, right, sent back over there, and it also shows me what information was sent back to the client, in this case was displayed out here. Okay. Now how do I use this? For that I have created another repository under GitLab. Okay, so you can go ahead and get started with this, right. You don't need to use this same GitLab repository, in fact you can't, because it's private domain, right. But you don't need anything. In fact, if you look at it, this repository that I have created does not even have any files associated with it. Okay, and all that it has is, it's just I created a repository, initialized it with a readme, and I'm done. Okay, now what happens is, in this case when I go to the repository, I can go down to settings on the left hand side, and it has an option out here to register a webhook. Okay, I click on webhooks, and what it tells me is these are the webhooks that are currently sort of registered for this particular repository. It asks me for a URL. I can specify something called a secret token over here, right. Now this is optional, right. What happens is, whatever I put into this information out here will be sent as a header, as an X GitLab token HTTP header, along with every request that is being made to the URL being provided above. Why is that useful? It means that in my receiver code, I can look for the GitLab token, and if the token is absent, I know that the request did not come from GitLab. Somebody else got hold of my URL and is just randomly calling me without really having useful information, right. Now this is especially important. For example, let's say that the URL is something that ultimately would post messages to a chat room. If someone got hold of that URL, right, and they did not have this GitLab token, it did not, and if you had not set a GitLab token, it would mean that just by posting some random data to that URL, you might start spamming the chat room, or even worse, right, you might even potentially be able to get information, or even, you know, in general disrupt whatever was the purpose of that URL. So this is a very simple form of security, right, which at least allows you to make sure that as long as you have a secret token over here which is not easily guessable and is also included with every request that is sent along to the webhook, the first thing you do inside the webhook receiving code is to ensure that the token is present. Now like I said, this is optional, right, it's not really that anything is being checked over here. So how do we do this? What I need to do in order to register a webhook is I can paste that URL in there, right. So what I did is I just took this same URL that had been given to me by Pipedream, right, and so this URL that was provided to me by Pipedream, I take the same thing and put it in as the URL for GitLab to call. I don't provide a secret token, I'm not particularly interested over here, or I could, you know, just try it out. I could put in some information out here, right, testing GitLab, and what I say is that I'm going to do this for push events. Okay, I could in fact select what kind of events. Now this makes it even more interesting. What it says is I could, for example, select only tag push events. What is a tag? A tag in Git is something that allows you to take a particular commit and associate some special functionality with it, maybe a new feature release or a bug fix or something like that, right? So a tag push is usually made whenever you have some improvement on the code or something that you want to flag on the code that says, okay, this is something special. It's not just a temporary commit. I've actually got some functionality that I want to mark clearly, which means that you could choose that only for tag push events this particular URL is called, right? Or maybe for any kind of comment added to an issue or confidential comments, events on issues, right? There are a whole bunch of different options that you have over here that you could select. It also allows you to enable SSL verification. This is usually useful. Where you would want to skip this is, let's say that you are running it on either an HTTP endpoint or you are running on HTTPS but with your own privately signed certificate, right? Maybe you are just running it on a browser, on a server that does not have a proper SSL certificate. Generally not a good idea because that opens up other possibilities of data leaking out, which is why by default they enable SSL verification. So once you have put all this in, you can just add webhook, right? And you can see that it's now registered down here. There is one webhook associated with this. Alright, so now let's go and look once again at Pipedream, right, your request bin, and it just says on the left hand side that today at some particular time there was an HTTP GET request. What I'm going to do now is to go back to GitLab and I want to test if this particular webhook has been registered. So what do? I can just click on test and generate a push event, okay. Now what happens when I generate this push event, you can see for a moment that GitLab sort of goes through and finally it puts a message up here saying hook executed successfully and that it received an HTTP 200 response to the request. Where did that response come from? Let's go back to request bin and we can see that now there is an HTTP post sitting up here, okay. And it was this HTTP post that basically responded with a 200 code, okay. Look on the right hand side and it gives you the full details of what exactly was sent as part of the HTTP post, right. You can see that this was the trigger, right, and a couple of things to notice. One is that among the headers you find that there is this thing, the X GitLab token, right, which is testing GitLab, which is exactly what we had asked it to put in. There are also a few others, X GitLab event, right. So this, your hook, whatever is receiving it, could look at this and say, okay, this was a push hook. It was not for a comment or an issue. It was because actually a commit was pushed, okay. In this case I only just artificially did a test trigger, right. I did not actually push a commit. You could clone that repository, make some changes and push the data back and see that the same thing gets called, okay. There is a unique UID also that's provided here. But now let's look at the body over here of the trigger, right. This has a whole lot of useful information. It basically gives you a lot of detail about the present state of the commits, right. So this is the final state of the commit hash ID from Git. It tells you the number of commits that were there and in turn those commits, commit number 0, it tells you that the author, information about the author, it tells you what was the message. Now where did all this come from? These commits existed because while preparing the webhook repository, I pushed 2 or 3 commits into this system. If I had not done that, this entire information saying commits 3 would essentially probably not have been there. It would not have shown any commits, okay. It also gives me detail about the project. It tells me about the HTTP URL, the SSH URL, the home page of the project, lot of information regarding the project. So if you look at it, there is actually quite a lot of information. Even though I have been repeatedly saying that this is supposed to be a lightweight message, quite a lot of information has been sent by GitLab to your hook, okay. But if you think about it, it is still just plain text and it's not, it's not a huge amount of data. It's not megabytes of data that we are talking about over here, right. What is useful is all of this information can be parsed out nicely and I can actually make use of it for something. Now one point to note over here is that request bin is actually showing it in a very nice sort of structured manner, right, with all these you have the body and then the commits and project and so on. You might be wondering how exactly is this sent. Very simple, it was actually sent as JSON data. Okay, so which means that your actual post request would be able to just receive a chunk of JSON data, parse it internally, right? So Python, JavaScript, whichever backend language you are using, could almost trivially parse the JSON data and collect all of this information just as it is shown over here. Okay, and I can do this any number of times I want, right? I can go back and once again run a test, a push event, and you will see that once again it executed successfully. I have one more post over here, right, and pretty much exactly the same data. After all, nothing has changed on the repository. Okay, so request bin is useful just to let us see what is there in the request that came from GitLab, right? It's very useful, in other words, for debugging. It helps you to see what information would be there in the message sent to the webhook, right? The next question that we might be interested in asking is, how do I make use of it? For that, we could create our own receiver.